and we are live.
Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the meeting of the Exam Schools Admissions Task Force. Because this is a remote session, I will ask Ms. Parvex to call the roll, please.
Thank you, Mr. Contempasis. Mr. Acevedo, Ms. Aguirre, not sure if she's in yet. Mr. Chernow,
Here.
Mr. Kreger,
Here.
Dr. Prima Wisdom, Ms. Lam,
Here.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Here.
Ms. Garrett,
Here.
Dr. Tang,
Here.
Ms. Waite, Ms. Sullivan,
Present.
and Mr. Contempasis.
Present.
Thank you.
We are pleased to be offering live simultaneous interpretation this evening in Spanish, Haitian Creole, Cape Verdean, Portuguese, Cantonese, Mandarin, Vietnamese, Somali, Arabic, and American Sign Language. After I finish introducing the interpreters, we will activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. Click the icon to select your language preference. Our Spanish interpreter this evening is Randolph Dominguez. Will you please invite our Spanish-speaking audience to switch their Zoom channel in Spanish? Mr. Dominguez.
Hello, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Mr. Contempasis. My name is Randolph Dominguez. I'll be your Spanish interpreter for today. Now I will be giving instructions to the Spanish-speaking audience in Spanish. Muy buenas noches, damas y caballeros. Mi nombre es Randolph Domínguez. Voy a ser su intérprete del idioma español esta noche. Si a ustedes les gustaría escuchar esta reunión en el idioma español, deben de buscar en la parte inferior de su pantalla un icono que es como un globo terráqueo. Van a pulsar allí. Una vez pulsen allí, van a seleccionar el idioma español. Si están utilizando un celular, por favor, buscar los 3 puntos a la mano derecha de su pantalla. Y una vez lo hayan pulsado, busquen allí el idioma español y podrán escuchar la conversación en el idioma español. Muchas gracias. Buenas noches. Nos vemos en el otro lado.
Thank you. Our Portuguese interpreter is Christiane Leitner. Please give the Zoom instructions in Portuguese.
Olá, boa noite. Meu nome é Cristiane, eu sou intérprete de português brasileiro. Se você precisa de interpretação, tradução para essa reunião, na parte inferior da tela você vai ver um globo assim que for ativado. Você clica nele e escolhe o canal português. Se você estiver assistindo essa reunião pelo celular, você vai na parte superior direita da tela do celular, tem 3 pontinhos, ali você clica, vai em interpretação e escolhe o canal português. Obrigada.
Thank you. A Vietnamese interpreter is Yuan Tru. Please give the Zoom instructions in Vietnamese.
Good afternoon. I would be the Vietnamese interpreter for meeting today. Xin chào các anh chị có cần thông dịch người Việt xin bấm vào quả cầu và chọn ngôn ngữ là tiếng Việt thì Duyên sẽ cung cấp thông dịch liên tục cho các anh chị ạ. Thank you.
Thank you. Our Cantonese interpreter is Anna Se. Please give the Zoom instructions in Cantonese.
Thank you, Mr. Contempasis. 大家好，星期五下午好，我係 Anna， 我係你今日嘅同步翻譯喺廣東話嘅。如果你一陣睇到個地球儀嘅時候咧，麻煩你咧就揀 Chinese， 咁就會成功進入咗廣東話嘅翻譯頻道噶啦。咁如果你係用手機嘅話咧，咁麻煩你就要撳嗰3個點，咁再選擇更多，亦都會揀 Chinese， 就會成功進入咗廣東話翻譯頻道噶啦。多謝晒 ，Thank you so much。
Thank you. Our Mandarin interpreter is Terry Yin. Please give the Zoom instructions in Mandarin.
嗨，大家好，我叫 Terry， 我是你们的普通话翻译。待会呢，你们就在屏幕下方会看到一个地球仪的图标，然后你们点这个地球仪的图标，然后选择 Mandarin， 你就可以进入到普通话的翻译了。如果你是用手机或者是平板电脑上来的话呢，你选择屏幕下方的3个点， 再选择语言，然后你也可以选择到 Mandarin，就是普通话的翻译了。Thank you so much.
Thank you. Our Haitian Creole interpreter is Sergio Saint Hilaire. Please give the Zoom instructions in Haitian Creole.
Hi everyone, good evening. My name is Sergio Saint-Hilaire, Haitian Creole interpreter. C'est un plaisir encore pour nous avoir après-midi pour nous parler avoir de tout ça qui parle dit, je t'ai traduit pour vous et pas hésiter tout ça qu'on a besoin de dire ou supposé dire et puis il faut entrer dans la conversation. Et il y a un globe en partie qu'on là, ou cap cliquer et puis ou cap entrer dans la parole là pour cap dire son pensée, pas hésiter. Et nous très contents pour nous avoir encore une fois et nous souhaitons bonne écoute. Merci.
Thank you. Our Arabic interpreter is Ahmed Al-Rubaye. Please give the Zoom instructions in Arabic.
مرحبا، أنا اسمي أحمد الربيعي وأنا سأكون مترجم اللغة العربية لهذا اليوم. بإمكانكم الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية وذلك بالذهاب إلى أسفل الشاشة. ستشاهدون علامة الكرة الأرضية. اضغط على هذه العلامة وستظهر لك اختيارات اللغات. اضغط على علامة اللغة العربية وعندها ستتمكن من الاستماع إلى الترجمة باللغة العربية. شكرا جزيلا. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Our Somali interpreter is Camilla Fatun Jamal. Would you please give the Zoom instructions in Somali?
Hello, good evening, everyone. My name is Fartun Kamila Jamal. I'm going to be your interpreter for Somali today. Magacaygu waa Fartun Kamila Jamal and waxaan ahay tafsirihiina tarjumaanihiina. Marka waxaad ii heli kartiin qolka Soomaaliga wixii aad u baahan tihiin ama codkayga dhegeysan kartiin shirka maanta meesha laga qabanayo. Marka waa soo dhawaada. Thank you.
Thank you. We also have American Sign Language interpreters. Welcome, Erin Foley and Celia Michal. Thank you all for assisting us this evening. We will now activate the interpretation icon at the bottom of your screen. I'd like to remind everyone to speak at a slower pace to assist our interpreters. We will now move on to the approval of the minutes from the May 14th, 2021 student listening session. At this time, I would like to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
So,
Is there a second?
Excuse me. Sorry, excuse me. Did you say the May 14, 2000?
That's what
That's a listening session.
It was not a listening session. I'm sorry.
Sorry.
That's okay. We do have a second. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion eliminating my error in calling it a student listening session? Hearing none,
Can we just clarify which date are those minutes?
the minutes as I read them, Ms. Sullivan, are May 14th.
Thank you.
Ms. Parvex, will you please call the roll?
Thank you, Mr. Condopasis. Mr. Acevedo,
yes.
Ms. Aguirre, Mr. Chernow,
Yes.
Mr. Kreger,
Yes.
Dr. Prima Wisdom, Ms. Lam,
Yes.
Ms. Nagasawa,
Yes.
Ms. Garrett,
Yes.
Dr. Tung,
Yes.
Ms. Wade, Ms. Sullivan,
Abstain.
Mr. Contompasis.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. We now move on to item 4. We're honored this evening to have with us Dr. Laurie Shepard, University Distinguished Professor from the University of Colorado Boulder, to talk to us about the use of tests in selective school admissions. Before I turn this over to Dr. Tung for an introduction, I would ask Ms. Sullivan if you have any comments before we begin.
No, Mr. Condompasis, no comments. However, just want to extend my gratitude to our distinguished guest this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Tung, if you will.
Yes, I'm pleased to introduce Professor Laurie Shepard. Besides being distinguished professor at University of Colorado, she's past president of the American Educational Research Association and past president of the National Council on Measurement and Education. These two bodies, along with the American Psychological Association, publish the standards for educational and psychological testing. The reason I asked her to join us this evening is because of her expertise in what makes a test valid and fair for use in selective school admissions, and for her uncommon ability to make that expertise understandable to the lay audience. Thank you, Laurie, for sharing your time and knowledge with us.
Thank you for the invitation. Now I'm going to share my screen, I hope. And you probably know that, good, I got the thumbs up that you can see it. But interestingly, I do not, let me turn it to this slideshow. And now I have it. That's better for me to be able to advance it. Interestingly, the interpretation words are right on top of my arrows. So it's going to be interesting to see if I can make it work. It's going to work anyway. I got an animation notice. I'm grateful to be here this evening. I hope that I can speak appropriately. I'm so impressed with the several translations that you are providing, which is part of inclusivity. So congratulations for that. It's not working. I can't get to the arrows. So
excuse me, you can move the
scrolling. Oh yes,
yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem.
That's what the hands were for. Thank you. So I wanted to acknowledge, and I have just 8 slides, so mostly I think you want to ask me questions, but I wanted to give you a couple of summary points and then show you some graphs that might clarify those points. So I wanted to acknowledge with these first 2 bullets, the tensions that I understand the task force members already fully understand. That because you're selecting students to participate in rigorous academic work, they have to come with the knowledge and skills that enable them to participate fully. At the same time, we are aware that, and we have data about this across the board, that standardized tests are correlated with family income. And this is important for your consideration. Standardized tests have greater disparate impact, meaning they show a greater difference between groups, especially between white Americans and historically marginalized African-American and Latino students. Those differences are greater on standardized tests than on other academic measures such as grades. In the college admissions, grades are better predictors, meaning the correlation with subsequent success are higher. And that's most likely, the last part of this bullet is a little bit speculative. This isn't proven. The differential is well established. Why grades predict better than test scores is most likely because grades are cumulative. Many courses, including some subjective teachers, some unfair teachers, but the aggregate that's represented in grades is much more cumulative than a one-time test performance. And also, and this is important as to who gets picked, grades reflect effort in a way that a one-time test does not. So, and when I was explaining this to Roseanne ahead of time, I was trying not to use the word lazy, because that's sort of offensive, but it is possible that students that typically don't exert a lot of effort can do well on a test, a one-time test, and not necessarily do well on grades that require sort of being in it for the long haul. So here is just a summary of lessons from the SAT and ACT. We have much more research on college admissions than on admissions into high school. So with caution, here are some things we can say from that robust body of research. High school GPA, so HSGPA is high school GPA abbreviated, and SAT, this is generally about the same for the ACT, measure academic preparedness and predict student success. And the criterion, that is the outcome measure that's used in all of those studies, is either freshman GPA or graduation rates, like the percent of students in a school who complete college. The SAT combined with high school GPA improves prediction of college GPA by about 15%. And notice it's in that order that it's done by institutions because, as I said earlier, grades are better predictors. So they start with that and then they add incrementally the information from the SAT. Test scores reflect unequal high school opportunities. And this is part of your dilemma and your decision-making. Some of that difference in opportunity is not immediately reparable. So that's why advocates for tests or for some strict selection criterion they don't want to say, well, we're sorry that you didn't learn those things, because in this situation, we need you to have learned those things. So that's what you're wrestling with when you're saying, well, we need a test. Be aware that a test also reflects test wiseness, that is practice taking those kinds of measures, test preparation, which can inflate scores. That's a bias when that happens. And by inflation, I mean students do better on the test than is true if they were given a parallel measure that didn't have quite the same familiarity. And also, especially for students of color who are in historically marginalized circumstance, stereotype threat can affect test scores, and that has been demonstrated repeatedly by research. So this last bullet on this slide is meant to make the main point that I think you have to think about. Given modest predictive correlations, tests should never be used as if they were perfect predictors or as if they were perfect measures of merit. And that's what, to make that point is what I picked these graphs to help me illustrate. So here is a graph of a perfect correlation. And I'm going to have to explain the axes on this graph because since this never happens in nature, it's never really true, that two things are perfectly correlated. This is out of an online stat book, and it shows a straight line on the diagonal. So let me just suggest then that you have to imagine that if the x-axis, that is the horizontal axis, were the test score, measuring from the lowest score on the left to the highest score on the right, a perfect correlation, that's a correlation of 1, would correspond perfectly, and all those dots, imagine those are examinees, lined up, and their grades, which is the vertical y-axis, their grades are perfectly predicted by their test score. And this is what sometimes people imagine when they're, I think, sometimes overzealous in arguing for the test. So then here is an actual, this is older SAT data, but it still shows you here by adding up 2 SATs so that the highest score is 1600. We see on the x-axis this sum of the 2 SAT scores predicting freshman GPA. And notice that it's scattered. They aren't perfectly organized along a single line. And what that means is that some students with, let's say, a cumulative or a added score of 1400, some of them would get A's, but some of them would get C's, as is illustrated by the vertical spread in this graph. To use this example further, and what I think you have to think about when you're thinking about the possibility of a test, is to imagine this selection decision. So these lines are imposed to give the example of someone that says, well, we don't really want to admit anyone if they can't earn at least a B, or in this case, a 3.0 on the vertical axis at our school. And then if you draw that line straight across and see where it intersects the regression line, I'm not going to give you a lecture on regression, so you just have to follow this reasoning, then I can say that that corresponds to a sum verbal and mathematics score of 1300. And then this is just leading up to a further elaboration of this graph here, where I've colored them in so that I can talk to you about the trade-offs that you're making when you use a test for what in the field is called strict top-down selection. Thinking back to that perfect correlation, if you believe the test is a perfect measure of merit, then you do what's called top-down selection. You pick the first and the second and the third straight down by test score until you run out of spaces in the situation you're selecting for. When you do that with an imperfect predictor, you see what happens in this graph. The gold area shows us the students who are above the selection criterion of 1300, but notice they actually don't do as well in school as they were predicted to do. And these students' privilege is at the expense of the students in the gray shaded area who could do quite well, but if we have a strict cutoff, they're prevented literally from having that experience. So I'm happy to answer more questions about this. I have one more slide to share. And this is just a couple comments because I was told that you're thinking about the NWEA MAP tests. 2 points. One, I looked at the materials. It's important to be careful about the claims around differential item functioning or item bias research. And I've done a lot of research on using these indices myself. They do not make a test unbiased. The way they work is a little bit circular, and this is acknowledged in the literature, even though I agree with the statement that this is an industry standard. Everybody who makes tests uses diff statistics and item bias and makes item bias inferences after review of those items that showed differential item functioning. What diff statistics do is to flag items after we've said the group difference is this amount. The average group difference is this much on this test, using total score as the criterion. And then what these statistics do is flag any items that have bigger differences, bigger than this agreed upon amount as specified by the total score. Diff statistics do not make the two groups equivalent unless they were equivalent to start with. So you shouldn't think that because the test makers do the responsible thing, which is screen as a flag for any crazy items, like remember the old polo examples on the SAT a long time ago, but it doesn't take care of other issues of bias. The other thing that I was surprised about in Massachusetts that has one of the more well-regarded state tests is that you're choosing or thinking of choosing the NWEA MAP test. That is surprising because in all multiple choice or predominantly multiple choice and some what we call selected response, no open-ended items is my understanding. That means you cannot measure well the things in your state's curriculum frameworks having to do with things like mathematical modeling, argumentation, etc. So if you're going to consider a test, I would argue that grades are better than tests. But if you're going to choose a test, consider whether the MCAS isn't the better test. Okay, let me bail out of this so that you can ask questions.
Great, thank you so much. I see Mr. Acevedo.
Ms. Shepherd, thank you. I think you may have addressed this in your presentation. And something that you said near the opening of your presentation and just now at the end, kind of these sort of twin concerns. You opened it by sort of, you gave I heard a comment about, yes, different institutions may grade people differently, but they average out. And then at the end, you recommended the MCAS as a measure. The challenge here is having some way to fairly assess all students from private schools, students who are homeschooled, students from charter schools, and students from an impressive variety of schools, even within the Boston Public Schools district, whose grading system, even their grading schemes, can be a mind-boggling montage. How is that more fair than not having some method where we can, give the students, yes, an opportunity to, yes, share their grades, but also find a level playing field, so to speak, for all students to communicate their readiness for exam schoolwork. And that's actually one of the challenges of MCAS. I mean, it crossed our minds during the working group, perhaps even to use the MCAS as a measure. The problem with that is MCAS in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts is only administered to schools that are part of the public school system. So they're not administered to private schools and other schools outside of the system, so they wouldn't have access to that. So if that's not the measure, then what are our options?
Well, let me try to think about this the way the Regents Colorado or the Regents at the University of California have thought about it. And for some of the reasons and the tensions that I laid out for you, both California and Colorado, and in fact, quite a number of other major universities nationally have gone to test score optional because if the only thing that is uniform is not very good, you're really, to get sameness, you're making a sacrifice. So I want to characterize it for you as a dilemma. One example is that universities are aware that the more they've moved away from tests, the more there's been pressure on grade inflation. So they've gone to a combination of GPA and rank in class. So you could consider, for example, that you're proficient in your state meets expectation. And my understanding, because I did do a little bit of homework beforehand, my understanding is that meets expectation is analogous to proficient in other states. So it's not a low level. It's at the level of academic work that we expect at grades. So you could consider your MCAS proficient. And I understand that's not helping you with private schools unless that contractor would be willing to allow test administration. So those are things I would encourage you to think about rather than choosing lowest common denominator. You're having to choose a lowest common denominator solution that's not great because of its uniformity. And so usually uniform isn't always fairest. I think it's right for me to leave it for you as a dilemma. This is what you're facing. I'm not going to give you a pat answer. Oh, easy.
Dr. Shepherd, thank you. I wanted to just follow up on that question. Is there any research that supports the notion that assessments create a level playing field for students?
Well, in the 1990s, there was a lot of belief that if we could make, and I'm friends with these people, so I say it respectfully, because I was part of all the research that was done in the 80s that showed the distorting effect of teaching to the test. So people said, that's horrible. Let's make more ambitious tests worth teaching to. And there was a spate of efforts in the first round of standards-based reform to create more open-ended, more ambitious, more performance-based assessments. And there was some evidence during the 90s when people were trying that they got, for example, did more writing assessment and got students then did more writing and learned to write better. So that would be an example of where you can push curricular change with certain kinds of assessments and get everybody working toward more ambitious goals for everyone. That all went out the window when No Child Left Behind was passed. Because what No Child Left Behind did was put a lot of accountability pressure on and quadrupled the amount of testing that was required. And therefore, states could no longer afford portfolio assessments. They couldn't afford performance assessment that had to be scored by teachers to work with open-ended answers, et cetera. All the invention went out. So I want to say no. I want to say no, assessments don't, especially when they're low-level tests, multiple choice, where you're rewarding drilling on that kind of measure. But I wanted to tell you the 1990s story, so I wouldn't be ignorant of that. You just have to think about the context we're in right now.
Thank you. Ms. Garrett.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Dr. Shepherd. I think you lifted up really well the dilemma. As you said, I think that you named the tensions really clearly. And a lot of the suggestions that you named are robust conversations that we've had as a working group and are starting to have as a task force in this iteration. Just to share a little bit, because my question for you, I think, is going to be what factor should measure whether students have the requisite skills for challenging environments, which was your first bullet on your first slide. But to give you a little more context on Boston, kind of piggybacking where Mr. Acevedo was, not only are we not able to administer the MCAS to a large portion of our applicants, but just to share, I'm the head of school at one of the exam schools. Our entering class this year, we're pleased to welcome students from over 100 schools. So when we think about ranking students within a school community, we could be talking about populations as small as 1 or as large as 50. So I think just layering that complication on. I was also really interested in your research comparing to a college environment, but understanding that the context is quite different, obviously. And talking to college admissions officers to get their sense of how test optional is going, they talk about the value of the
Ms.
transcript.
Garrett, could you slow down your cadence?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
I apologize. When you talk to admissions officers with the new test optional model, they talk about the value of the transcript and how much you can learn about the transcript from the rigor of the classes and the consistency of grades, as you mentioned. Per our model, because we're looking at elementary school students and middle school students, the number of grades and teachers is a lot smaller than a high school is able to present at the end of their high school career. With some school structures, we could be looking at grades from as few as 1 teacher and max 4. There was a great suggestion from a student to the group recently that we should consider subjects other than math and English to get a larger variety of those courses. However, many schools in the city and outside of the city do not teach the same subjects. So there wouldn't be available grades for science or history. And I appreciate your letting me be so long-winded. I'm getting to the question. I'm reading Ms. Sullivan's mind, but I just wanted to give Dr. Shepherd a little bit more context because I know she's done that homework. With those tensions in mind, that's why I said dilemma is perfect. What is your recommendation for a measure to indicate whether students have the requisite skills for the academically challenging environment in the absence of an assessment? And I do really appreciate your point about multiple measures and the helpfulness of them in combination. So thank you for your patience.
Oh, okay, so here's, and now, this is my way of thinking about it. And it doesn't have the adamancy of there's this many studies. Don't ignore the studies that I'm summarizing. So now I'm thinking, here's my stance. I think it is not forgivable if there are any students, especially African American and Latino, traditionally marginalized students in the city, in your pipeline, your feeder schools, who scored proficient on MCAS and are denied admission because that's a reasonably high standard. There aren't tons of those students in those schools. And so that, I think what you could do to try to deal with the fact that lots of schools don't have it. I did see that NWEA has equated, they can tell you what their score is equal to a 500. So they have a comparison score. So here's MCAS. If MCAS lifts you up and makes you eligible, then you could let students in from your feeder schools. But then if you have all these other schools that need the information, you could say, well, we'll administer NWEA to those students. There are lots of things that worry me about the NWEA. I showed you the one about multiple choice. The other thing you should notice is that the grade change on their vertical score scale, like from 6th grade to 7th grade, to be equated at 500, 500 on those separate grades, it's a small change on their score scale. And I have to try to figure that, I have to spend some more time thinking about that, but that means what, a whole grade level difference could be worth 2 points or 5 points on their scale. I have to try to learn some more things about that. So I'm not accusing, I'm raising a question, because I am actually suggesting that you consider MCAS where you have it and NWEA when you don't. And don't lose track of grades are better. So do you want to consider top ranked students from your feeder schools and not a test? I hope you're giving that a lot of thought. And I know you've discussed the Texas model, the idea of selecting top students across schools. And I understand that's harder for you in public-private, crossing those boundaries.
Thank you. It's very helpful.
Thank you. Mr. Kreger.
This is a wonderful presentation and particularly insightful responses to our questions, Dr. Shepherd. I wanted to follow up on your point that with grades being more predictive, there are schools that use a portion of a student's standardized test performance. And I didn't quite get that point from earlier in your remarks. Could you elaborate on that?
Thank you for asking the question, because I passed over that kind of quickly. I said that when you use grades as the main predictor, you get incrementally about 15% more prediction, but they don't do it by adding a piece. So that's on me. They add the two things together, standardize each and add them together. And then they can see in the combined regression equation how much more prediction they get. That's where that 15% comes. But be careful, as soon as you add the test score in, its mean difference consequences are as severe as if you were using only it. So that dilemma of exaggerating group differences with the test score happens as soon as you decide to use grades plus test score.
Thank you. Another just quick question, Dr. Shepherd. Your last slide, last bullet point. Actually, I'll let Mr. Contenpasses go. Go ahead, Mr. Contenpasses.
Again, I echo what Mr. Krager said. Thank you for your presentation. We have historically in Boston used a combination of a test and a set of grades covering probably a year and a half of student achievement in grades 5 and 6 for entry into the 7th grade. Recognizing that there are problems on either side of the equation. For example, we have had criticism around gaming the test by families that have access to test prep, taking advantage of that. We've had arguments around the use of the test in terms of all of the things that you've raised. This is truly a dilemma for us because we are also operating in an environment that is struggling, to be perfectly honest, with making certain that in addition to the exam schools, all of the others are on a par with the exam schools in terms of outcomes. So when I raise the issue, and as Ms. Skerritt has suggested, there's a lot more information available when a student is entering freshman year at a university than it is for a 6th grader entering 7th grade. And to make the record straight, I'm opposed to a straight exam. But again, we are struggling with how then do we determine the readiness of the pool of applicants in such a way that we, and I'll use the term, compensate for all of the difficulties that you can imagine exist, not only in our district, but in most urban districts. So there's a question in there somewhere. Again, it revolves around, recognizing the inconsistencies of any measure. An essay, for example, has inconsistencies. You can imagine that. But, is there a way that you can see a district utilizing multiple factors and then doing what this task force did, trying to indeed add factors that are probably beyond the control of the individual students seeking a seat at one of the schools. So I think, if not this, and by the way, MCAS has not been given in Massachusetts now for 2 years.
Right.
So that's an added dilemma in our pocket full of dilemmas. So I guess what I'm struggling with is, can we do this in such a way that we identify the readiness of the pool, identify students who indeed show promise, and early on work with those students and offset what has become, for lack of a better term, the gaming of the process?
Yes, gaming can even apply to grades, and grade inflation is a worry. And that's why I think I mentioned that colleges are now looking at grades and rank, because that's who knows the kids. The teachers in their schools are when they rank the students, are having to say, yes, this student is performing better than that student. And so it wouldn't happen that way for admission into 7th grade or high school level. It would happen by saying, by inviting teacher nominations. I think it's important to consider that you don't want the existing, I don't know if this is the environment you're alluding to, the existing inequities. Some schools are providing more opportunity to their students than other schools. And you don't want that to just control who gets subsequent opportunities. That's the whole tracking research that I'm sure you know about. And so you want to disrupt that, especially by asking for more nominations from the schools that have been historically not feeders. And what kind of evidence would those schools like to offer?
Thank you.
Mr. Chernow?
Hi, thank you again for coming. This has been very informative. You know, I've just been listening and trying to get a better grasp on a lot of what you've been saying and a lot of what other people are questioning, because it kind of seems like there's a dilemma between like the idea of prioritizing students based on their prosperity at a young age, but then at the same time saying they're too young, so we don't have enough data to prioritize them. So it's like this, so it's almost like we're trying to find something that's not there, but we're still looking. It kind of feels like that. So my question is, we've also discussed and have heard from testimonies of a number of different ways to measure that could work like together, not as like on their own, of course. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on like something like looking at grades and also like having a lottery system per school. Like, let's say like accepting a certain number of students from every elementary school based on a combination of like, we talked about socioeconomic status. We could also just talk about like size of the high school. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on like something where we can both look at grades and try and make sure that grade inflation doesn't play too much of a part, while also, you know, making sure it's equitable and also providing some type of fairness for BPS students. The one other thing that I'll just mention, then you can respond, is that another thing we've talked about is also providing like a little bonus for BPS students coming from 6th grade and 6th grade. So yeah, I just, it's kind of a blurry question, but what are your thoughts on, you know, some other methods of entrance?
Well, I tried to stay away from rewarding Boston students, public school students, because that is a value of mine, but it feels political. So I was trying to not champion that too much, but you know, if you, and I think you have to consider that not everyone who doesn't have an MCAS score is in a privileged circumstance, but they are correlated. And that's part of why your subsequent conversations with this group should be about, should we give a nudge? And then let me also answer your question about a lottery, because that's another way to think about fairness. And so what I would argue, though, is to be sure that everyone you're making eligible for the lottery can succeed if people make the requisite effort. I cannot make up for how inequitable things have been, but I want to open up and create greater opportunity. So for example, if in the state, 53% of the students are proficient on MCAS, but that would let in too many students if you said everybody who was proficient on MCAS can come, then you could do a lottery within all of those who are qualified. So you could open things up a bit and then use your lottery, as opposed to it's just random. Because frankly, since we were talking politics before, you'll lose the fight if you completely give up on academic qualifications in the short run. My position and the talk I could give, is what research about tracking tells us about its unfairness, about its perpetuation, et cetera, et cetera. But I also acknowledge that I can't immediately undo the consequences of all the inequity that has come before. So I want to expand the set of opportunities, make it possible. And I think a lottery within qualified examinees or students would be the way to think about it. Thanks for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Kreger.
You don't mind time for a follow-up. Dr. Shepherd, I wanted to better understand a context for the notion of teacher nominations. Right? I'm pulled to the top X% idea, but I'm reticent of a situation where in a classroom of 20, there are only 2 who make that top 10%, or other barriers that feel perhaps artificially or arbitrarily imposed. And I like the notion of a teacher nomination system, perhaps as a substitute for that, but it sure seems like it would need guardrails for it too, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and so if we've, as a city, been recently reminded that for every student who's accepted, right, there are students who are told that they are not worthy of these schools, right? And that's quite a statement to make toward the educational future of our youth when they're in 6th grade, right? And I'm curious about what guardrails or parameters you would put on this teacher nominations idea to help address the concerns that we share.
Well, I think each thing needs guardrails, and I would not use teacher nomination instead of 10%, top 10%. I would use them together. So you're collecting evidence. So it's a portfolio or a body of evidence from a school. And so in essence, that's going to create a lot of dilemmas for those schools, because it's not a formula. And maybe the top 10% is the formula, but people are going to then have an argument. They're going to say, this student arrived late, but deserves, is a newcomer, but deserves this. I can imagine headaches for the schools to try to implement the Texas model. But it is one that, to Simon's earlier question, could respect the Boston feeder schools and gives you a way of thinking about everyone. Then if you're doing the top 10% per school, you're really ensuring participation across all the schools.
I think, Ms. Sullivan, are there any more hands? I can't.
I know there are not, but I still have my question that I was holding. I wanted to give
Okay, go ahead. Last question.
So, Dr. Shepherd, for me, what I continue to struggle with is, I guess, accepting that. I mean, the very nature of the conversation, and it was shared. Matt mentioned it. You mentioned it. The very nature of having the exam schools creates a situation where there are children every year who get a yes and children every year who get a no. there are, by the very nature and structure of this, we have a system of winners and losers every year for students. And it's devastating every year for students. It's just, and we don't know which student is going to be happy and which family is going to be happy and which family and which student is going to be devastated. And so for me, I have a very, my fairness bone on this is very firm. And it's hard because at square one, I do believe we have a system that already has, again, winners and losers. That said, I'm also thinking about and processing what you've shared today about the assessments and bringing the research into the conversation relative to the assessments, and understanding that just because of factors that, you know, many of us have no control over, we have, with the assessments, we can exacerbate inequities. And so I've got a system that at square one has some unfairness, perhaps some might believe. And then I'm thinking about using a tool in this process that the research shows can exacerbate unfairness and inequity. So I'm trying to figure out how to deal with that. And I guess where I'm landing on this at this moment is a question about how assessments could be used, recognizing how they, again, the research shows the inequity that exists when using them, how they could be used to help in this process, but not be determinative in this process. And so you mentioned something about, something about the qualifier, and I think it was on your regression model, on your, where you talked about kind of how the test, well, you weren't describing it in this way, but this is the way I was processing it in my mind, but almost how the assessment or how assessments can be used to help inform who may be ready, but not necessarily determine who is selected. Could you just tease that out a little bit? And I appreciate you helping me process this and think this through. Could you tease that out a little bit, like how an assessment might be used to help create a pool, but not be a determining factor from a selection standpoint?
Okay, I'm going to answer your second part first. And then I would like to come back to the overall unfairness and tracking question. So my answer to Simon was essentially, you can, instead of narrowly selecting as if you had a perfect top-down ordering of kids based on merit, you take a much bigger pool based on the test that everyone who's in the pool is qualified. And now we select on other criteria, or we select with a lottery. That's a way to answer the rigor without doing top-down selection. But I forced myself not to plan with limited time and your dilemma to make the tracking speech. But the research about the unfairness and the perpetuating of inequity. Tracking was started over 100 years ago by people who believed deeply in intelligence testing, and that number was the size of a lump in your head, overstating just a little bit, that you had at birth, and that nothing else would change that amount of capacity. And that heritability understanding persisted and was why people were sorted to fit what they could do, not to make them able to do, right? And then we spent 100 years in psychological research on human learning and development to finding out the ways that intellectual capabilities are developed. They're developed by opportunity, by reasoning assignments instead of memorization assignments, on and on. And so I would applaud the recommendation that came out of the task force that said we shouldn't have elite schools that disproportionately serve those who've had privilege up to this point. We should work harder and sooner, because everyone says we should eventually do this. We surely should have more of these kinds of schools where everybody gets intellectually challenging problem solving. And I spent my COVID year and a half working completely remotely with kids from Fannie Lou Hamer Freedom High School in the Bronx, the poorest congressional district in the entire country. And they are part of 38 school consortia started in the 1980s that do all performance assessment, all project-based learning, and they are exempt from the Regents exam, so they don't have teaching the test, and they are exempt at CUNY from taking the SAT, and they outperform at CUNY their counterpart, equally poor, equally socioeconomically disadvantaged, in quotes, comparable students. And I think it's because they write. They do project-based learning, they learn in depth, and they're nearly all the kinds of schools who by traditional tests are predicted not to be able to do any of the things that they're doing. And it's true for all of the kids. Michelle Fine at CUNY did the research on what happened in those schools. Many more kids could profit from the kinds of curricula that are now afforded to only your 3 elite schools.
Thank you, Dr. Shepherd. I greatly appreciate that. I'm going to close out with Dr. Tung and then prophetic Simon. I said Dr. Chernow, Mr. Chernow. So Dr. Tung, oh, you're gonna let Simon go first? Dr. Tung? Okay.
Thank you, Professor Shepherd. I wanted to follow up on Ms. Sullivan's question around how assessments could be used to help but not be determinative. And your answer still implies that we set a score at which we cut those eligible from those not eligible. And I just, from my study of the past couple of months, anytime you use a cut score, it differentially affects kids by income, by race, even by gender, for math. And so the proportion of low income kids, for example, if we use SES, in that pool will always be smaller.
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. This idea of a minimum cut score was something that I first was a part of literally 30 years ago when the National Academy of Sciences was asked to evaluate the use of the general aptitude test battery back then in employment decisions. We said that what would be best to meet your 2 criteria, right? Rigor and diversity would be to do top-down selection within group. Because then everybody selected would be qualified. The test would have given us the best information it can provide, but we would have no group differences. And of course, that was illegal. So we did it by way of illustration. Like, could you get information from the test? Sure, here you go. So, and we said an alternative was to set a minimum score and then select with a lottery. So the only thing that would be reassuring to you and your legitimate criticism is that we would set it further down the scale, maybe at the 50th percentile, so that we would be sure that everyone, it would still lead to group differences though, because the 50th percentile per group is at a different score point. So the aggregate 50th percentile would differentially land on the various groups. So it's to Simon's point, like partially opening up. It's not a strict lottery. It's not strict top-down selection. It is a compromise way of thinking about it.
Thank you. Dr. Mr. Chernow, I want to keep calling you doctor. Sorry.
Hey,
Quick
man,
promotion
maybe
is
one
never
day.
proceeding.
Hey.
One day. Thank you again for just that last point. When you started speaking to your experience teaching with that school in the Bronx. So I, just for some context, I currently attend one of the exam schools. I'm a student at Boston Latin Academy. And this was really insightful to me because it really is helping me continue the question of what is the purpose of an exam school? What is the purpose of having a school greater or considered greater or more for the more educated or more advanced students, whatever word you would like use to describe, whatever word you would like to use to describe them. And then what's the point of then sending the quote unquote most advanced and educated students to those schools? It kind of seems illogical if you ask me. So just trying to slow down for the interpreters. So I don't get the experience of project-based learning at my high school. As someone who attends an exam school, the continual, perpetual AP tests, taking the honors, getting the best grades, and focusing on, maybe it's not MCAS, but focusing on AP tests, focusing on SATs, all these things that are instilled in us as exam school students from a very young age does not lead to the best performance. And I can speak for people in my grade and people that I talk to at school and myself who would much rather be able to do more creative project based. So I guess my question is, do you think that, well, I don't even know if this question is related, but do you think that part of what needs to change in this process may even be the curriculum that upholds exam schools?
God bless you. Yes, of course. So this test-driven environment has been exacerbated by politically year after year. So it's funny that we got rid of the worst understandings among scientists about IQ testing, but we just installed standardized achievement testing as the definition of who's smart, who's not smart, how to get ahead, etc. And there are a few colleges that like Colorado College is a private school in Colorado. I'm not affiliated with them, but it'd be an example of a school trying to do deeper learning. And if you want a reference about like what does deeper learning look like, the National Academy of Sciences for free has a synthesis report from 2018. You can download it. It's called How People Learn. It's the second issue, How People Learn 2. And there's a lot of brain research and there's lots and lots of research, but there's one chapter that's what does this mean for schooling? And we know from decades of research that deep learning is supported by things like having to explain your reasoning, having to draw a model mathematically, not just equations, not just simplifying equations, but actually showing that you understand how things work. So there are other ways of planning curricula, but you have to push against the politics of, frankly, lots and lots of middle-class parents who want their kids to get ahead. And so everybody subscribes to the tests as the representation of learning. And so we select on the test, to your point, and then we teach to the test, even in schools that promised a richer curriculum. So that is something that would be good to try to change.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shepherd. Mr. Contrepassas.
Yeah, I would just say we need to move on, but I couldn't leave without reinforcing, Dr. Shepherd, what you have just said. But getting there is huge, as you well know.
Yes.
We have schools of education. I hope the University of Colorado is not one of them that continues to teach potential teachers and potential leaders in the same way that reinforces a standards-based kind of opportunity. And no one will disagree, at least of all me, that it's really the responsibility of the districts to begin thinking about all of the things that you've just said, particularly in looking at skill sets similar to those that you've mentioned, the analysis, the collaboration. The model that we constantly use is broken. I think, I'll say it, you may think it. Getting there is huge. And in terms of Mr. Chernow and his experiences at Latin Academy, all they would have to do was to introduce a capstone project as a graduation requirement, which I believe should be a requirement for every senior in every Boston public school, at which they demonstrate what they have learned over the last few years in a manner that you've suggested. We're a long way from that, Doctor, and I want to thank you.
I appreciate the questions.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Shepherd. Appreciate your presentation, very thorough. Look forward to the slides for our reference as we move forward. Appreciate what you've given us to think about.
Good. Well,
Good.
my blessings. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Simon, you can email me anytime.
Maybe you can convince them to go to the University of Colorado.
Maybe so, exactly. All right.
And thank you, Dr. Tong.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm leaving now.
Thank you. The next item on the agenda talks about review of data requested. I don't remember whether what the status is of that data, but I'll turn it over to Ms. Hogan to see if there is anything else that we asked for that she has ably worked on.
Thank you, Mr. Contrepassas. So 2 things to share with you this evening. One is a set of maps that go back to the census tract and tiering data. I believe this is a request from Mr. Kreger, but I will walk you through those. And then Ms. Sullivan made a request at our last meeting around zip codes where there were fewer than 10 invitations, and sort of grouping them together to make sure we were still representing that data in the tables. So I will walk you through those 2 things. So I know I said this was a map. probably looking at it and saying, that's just a lot of text. But we will share this link along with the slides so you can take a look and sort of poke around at your leisure. But wanted to start, the first page of this just gives an overview. Most of this text is copied straight from slides that you've seen before, but it explains the methodology behind the tiering process with census tracts. So as a reminder, there are 5 indicators included in the tier calculation. Median household income, percent of households occupied by the owner, percent of families headed by a single parent, percent of households where a language other than English is spoken, and a weighted average around educational attainment. So this page includes that detail as well as a description of the 8 maps that are in this file. So the first tab, let me make this actually bigger. So this should look very familiar. There was a screenshot of this on a slide previously. The benefit of this over the screenshot is that you can actually zoom in and take a closer look at the map as you would like.
Awesome. Thank you.
Oh, there's more. So the next tab includes, and I think this was your specific request, Mr. Kreger, around the location of BPS schools in relation to the census tracts. So you can see as I hover over items, it shows for the census tract what the tract number is and what the tier designation is. And when you hover over the black dots, it tells you what school that is.
Ms. Hogan, a question. The black dots are K through 6s or K through 8s, or are they the entire district?
It's the entire district. We could edit it to remove schools that don't serve 6 to 8, if that would be helpful. But right now it is all schools.
Well, I for one would like to see it in the, with perhaps the high schools removed.
Oh.
But go ahead, go on.
Yeah, sorry, I'm just writing myself a note. The next tab shows public housing locations. So these locations are based on a map from, I believe it's bostonhousing.org is the website for the Boston Housing Authority. So it shows the locations for state family and federal family public housing in the city. The next 5 maps show the indicators within the tiers, so you can better understand what data is going into the tier calculation. So this map, the colors represent the percentiles. So essentially, for each indicator, we take the actual value of the variable, and then we rank them all and assign a percentile to show you the relative placement of each census tract. So this tab is median household income. The darker colors represent higher income. So the darker the tract, the higher the income. And when you hover over the tract, it will show you the median household income for that census tract. Very similarly, households occupied by the owner. as you hover over, you'll see the percentages. The darker colors here are a higher percentage of households occupied by the owner. The third indicator is families headed by a single parent. And in this case, the darker colors represent a lower percentage of families headed by a single parent. Number 4, households where a language other than English is spoken. This one is, again, the darker colors represent the lower percentage of households where a language other than English is spoken. And the last one is educational attainment, which this is it is a weighted average of 5 different indicators, which is explained on the overview page. But
I'm sorry, Monica, I'm speaking out of turn.
That's okay.
Is there some way to go back to the map demonstrating the concentration of households where a language other than English is spoken?
Yeah.
Wow.
And so this one, the darker colors are the lower percentages.
Oh, I see.
And you'll get this link so you can click through and zoom in and out as much as you would like. I wanted to provide an opportunity to give you sort of an orientation before just sending the link to you. So the last one around educational attainment is the weighted average of 5 data points. It's the percentage of adults who don't have a high school diploma, who have a high school diploma, who have attended some college, who have a college degree, and who have an advanced degree. I think I've said this before, but these are the indicators that Chicago has chosen. And so if this is something of interest to pursue, there is the consideration of, do we want to include all of the same indicators? Is there a different indicator of interest? That would be something to discuss, but wanted to show this as an example of what census tract data could look like. Any questions?
And you had me by the first tab and it only got better from there. So thank you very, very much, Monica.
Awful lot of work there.
I have a great team.
I see Dr. Tung's hand raised.
I can't even believe you produced this ahead of time. Thank you. Can you go back to the one with the dots for the schools? And when you hover over a dot, what information does it give you about the school?
Right now, it just tells you the name. I'm wondering if you're going to ask me to add the opportunity index score. We can do that, yes.
By the end of this, I will have memorized them, but I don't have that done yet.
For good measure, I will also ask the team to add the percentage of economically disadvantaged students.
Yep.
I don't see any other hands raised, Ms. Hogan. So thank you very much for this component.
And then the second item, how do I get out of this? And I'm going to apologize because the last 2 slides, the data is ready. It is just not quite in the slide yet. So I will fill it in and have it for Ms. Parvex to send out after this meeting. These are the tables from, I believe it was Tuesday. The days are running together. Where we looked at data by zip code, and we had removed some data for zip codes with less than 10 invitations. And so we've added a row across the bottom that adds all of the students who received invitations in those zip codes together. So their data is still present.
Great, thank you.
So do you want to walk through all of them, or?
I guess I'm trying to understand, well, not, you mean, I guess I'm trying to understand. I know, I see that Chinatown would be in that bottom row, Beacon Hill would be in that bottom row. Who else?
I'll add, before Ms. Parvex sends these out, I will add the list of which zip codes are
Excellent.
included.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know it's already 6:30, so I'm happy to walk through these, or
I guess what's new, is there something, what's new on this slide other than the last row?
That's it.
Okay, yeah, we walked through, yeah, I think we already walked through this. But yes, if you could add the zip codes, because the math isn't working out. If Chinatown and Beacon Hill and the West End or the /West End are the only two zip codes that are showing with less than 10 invites, but your total down there is 34. I think we're missing a zip code.
Yes, there are a couple additional zip codes
Okay.
on the table.
Great, thank you. And then, okay, oh, and you said that you're the other slides are coming.
Yeah, the remaining slides in this deck are all the same zip code tables from Tuesday.
Yeah.
With that row added for each one.
Okay,
so
that would be great. Thank you very much. Can we just walk through what's outstanding at this point?
I think that is actually
It may be that we need some time to take a look at what Ms. Hogan has given us. It may generate a few more questions. The census tract data with the Chicago tiers is intriguing to me anyways.
I think the one last I have on my list is the comparison, the more explicit comparison to the final simulations from the working group, which we have not put on a slide yet. But
can you repeat that, please?
The comparison to the final simulations from the working group, which was a request from Ms. Lum. I see her nodding.
Yes, I see her nodding too. Yeah, okay, great.
And
And
I think that's it.
Okay, I'm just gonna have, everybody knows what they asked for, just wanna, all other requests have been fulfilled at this point, folks? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you very much, Ms. Hogan. Appreciate it. I
Well,
think we're ready for public comment.
well, before we do
Oh,
that,
no? Okay.
there's an item here, on possible criteria for admissions. And I believe that Ms. Scarrett offered some thoughts at the last meeting, which she may want to review. If not, I am prepared, as I did with the work group, to offer some thoughts for consideration.
I hogged the last one. I just wanted to thank Ms. Hogan for that model. I look forward to digging in. And I just wanted to lift up two things that Mr. Acevedo and Mr. Kreger said at the end of the last meeting that might be helpful as we start this conversation. One was the idea that we potentially really start with a model that's already been built and vetted, both in practice and in litigation. And so I was going to ask today if we in Boston had all the data we need, if we wanted to pursue looking at the Chicago model and was struck by Dr. Shepard's comment that, you know, top-down selection within groups was actually a recommendation that she had, but was worried about the court response. And it sounds like Chicago is top-down selection within groups. So I just wanted to mention that as something that I'm very interested in as well. But I think Mr. Kreger's point that he mentioned was the need to revisit the effectiveness over time of our recommendation. And so the question Ms. Hogan asked about whether we should use the exact same criteria as Chicago or not seems like a potential, you know, option to start with a model that has shown some success elsewhere, but reserving the responsibility we would have to see whether that was the right criteria for Boston going forward, or whether other things should be considered in defining the tiers.
Thank you. First of all, I would like to offer these as suggestions for discussion, much like we did during the work group period. But before I do that, I want to mention to the task force, based on some of the comments that were made at the last session in public comment, that, and I think I echo what Ms. Sullivan would say as well, we're really humbled by the commitment that members of this task force have made over the year and a half, close to 2 years now, that we have been together. I believe that very strongly that we reached a point in the deliberations, and obviously there are disagreements, there always will be. But if you'll simply look at the results of the invitations, I believe that the task force has done a remarkable job in addressing the charge that was given to it by the superintendent initially and by the school committee that we currently work on, that we're currently working on. And so I just want to offer my thanks to all of you, recognizing the commitment, the dedication, and the time that you've put into this. I think it's time that we begin to really hone in on what it is that we think should be part and parcel of the conversation moving up to a very short timeline of June 9th. And so these are merely suggestions, categories that echo a bit for what Ms. Skerritt mentioned, going back and looking at what we were successful in and looking to offer some additional considerations around some other options. Let me begin by suggesting that these are my thoughts. I believe we ought to have a combination of an assessment and the grade point average as has been used in the past. The assessment can be used to determine the readiness of the pool, or it can be used as it has been in the past to determine a specific score for each of those parts. More discussion around that as we get to it. We were successful, I believe, to a certain point, utilizing the Be a Better grade level component. It's my hope that if the MCAS ever come back, that we may want to revisit, or someone may want to revisit that, but we don't have that right now. So we need some way of determining, in my mind, the readiness of the pool. I also think that we ought to give additional consideration if we go to a tiered system of whether we retain the 20/80 combination that we had, similar to what Chicago has put together. Whether we continue to use the zip codes and the median family income as we did, or we substitute some of the work that we now need to do around census tracts, we need to continue to have that component, whatever it shakes out to be. And it could be maintaining the zip codes and finding a way to offset the difficulty that we have all witnessed with families that are in low-income housing and families that are scattered throughout the city who don't come anywhere near the median income. And perhaps the census tracts could help there. I would also like to suggest a component where we add 10 points to the total score of any student currently attending a school in Boston where poverty level is 50% or above as an additional criterion. By my reckoning, through Ms. Hogan's data, that would mean roughly 63 schools consisting of BPS and charters. And we could certainly ask for the same evidence from our non-BPS components as long as they would certify that that's the case. But some sort of incentive that would offset some of the difficulties that some of our youngsters are experiencing within the district now. I do believe that we ought to have a periodic review by the district, not necessarily this task force, of the outcomes that are generated by this change. And those reviews should be done before a contract for a vendor, if that's the way they're going to go, is either extended or renewed, to see indeed whether all of the things that we've put in place are working. I also think we need to develop and implement an anonymous wellness survey for the students at the 3 exam schools. And it should be given annually to deal with a whole host of issues that have surfaced over the last few years, to deal with things like isolation, to deal with things which might be better dealt with through professional development of the adults, any number of things. I just think it's good practice. I think we ought to reemphasize and retain the testing phenomenon that we put in place to be done weekly for BPS students and on Saturdays for all others. It has shown to be effective in terms of increasing access to the examination. It should be retained. We should also retain the untimed nature of the assessment if it's so required by an IEP. That should be built into our recommendations, in my opinion. We should ensure that the task force recommendation approved by the Boston School Committee is fully funded, that every grade 4 through 6 student in every BPS school is offered the opportunity to participate in a program developed at the school or by the district that will enhance that student's opportunity in sitting for an exam school seat. And I also think that the summer boot camp that we recommended be fully funded and continued during the length of this process so that it doesn't happen to be a one-year deal. And so those are a series of recommendations. I will leave you with one final thought. We have been dealing with a situation where the total number of students impacted is close to 800 in the 3 exam schools. There are close to 25,000 students in grade 7 through 12 in BPS who could use the same degree of engagement and involvement and change. So I don't envision that there's total acceptance of all of this, but I do think by my counting, we might have 5 or 6 meetings left. We need to move to a series of recommendations, and I trust you would take these in the spirit that they're given as a focus of our ongoing additional conversations.
Thank you, Mr. Contopasis. Could you circulate your recommendations? I'm going to ask this of everyone else. Could you circulate your recommendations so that people have them in writing? Do others have recommendations? And I am mindful of time here that they would like for the task force to consider. Yes, Ms. Lum.
I would like to put on the table discussion around a lottery. I don't know at what point and where, but I do think that the randomness of a lottery can offset some of the perceived biases of not having a lottery system in place, if the lottery is done right.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who at this time wants to share their thoughts? Yes, Ms. Nagasawa, and then Mr. Chernow.
I suppose to add a little bit on to Mr. Contopasis's recommendations, I think if we go with something like the Chicago model, wherein we have the tracks and the socioeconomic ranking, I think it would be important to, as Mr. Contopasis said, factor in the fact that there are people who there is a great amount of economic diversity within a neighborhood and even within a census tract. And there could be someone within a census tract who has an income that is far below the median. So I think if we ask people to self-report their family income and how many people are in their family so that we get a sense of family economic status, I suppose we can we can compare that to the median income. And if a family, a low economic status family lives in a higher economic status neighborhood, perhaps they could be moved into another tract and be considered for admissions in another tract. And of course, there is room for dishonesty in the system if it's just self-reported. So I think if wealthier families self-report an income that is far lower than the median of where they live, that can be red flagged and investigated further, and perhaps it can lead to their disqualification in consideration in an effort to keep the system honest.
Thank you, Ms. Nagasawa. Mr. Chernow, and then Mr. Kreger, and then Ms. Lum.
Thank you. I don't have a finalized, I don't think any of us do. Well, I personally don't have a finalized full thought of how this process should work, but I'm going to propose that we don't use a test to get into an exam school, and we focus on the 3 main categories that I could think of that I've been thinking about, which are GPA, BPS student, and socioeconomic status in Boston.
Thank you. Mr. Kreger.
I'm just going to echo the note that I've heard both tonight and before, that, and this is in no criticism of anything that's been leveled here, right? But that part of our job is to make this as clear and as easy to understand for every parent and every student in the district, to Ms. Garrett's point last time we met. And further to her point, I'm quite intrigued by this notion that both she and Mr. Contempasis put forward, which would be a plus for any student attending a school with a higher proportion of economically disadvantaged students. I think combining that with academic and other factors would hold true whether you are private, parochial, charter, or BPS or otherwise, and may, to some degree, further efforts at greater participation in all of our schools, particularly in all of our public schools. So I'm intrigued by these options. I would love to see a way to map out the top 10 or top X% plan, especially with some of the other factors that Dr. Shepard introduced to us tonight around the notion of teacher nominations. And I think we are in a situation of having multiple good options to meet our charge. And that's especially true because of who we've assembled as a task force and the information that has been brought to us by BPS and those we've invited to speak. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lum?
I was also thinking about, in terms of the body of data from which we are doing our research, we've been looking at families of median income, but the finer pool would actually be families in the 6th grade and families in the 7th grade. So it's the applicant pool or eligible applicant pool that I'm wondering should perhaps be a factor as well.
Thank you. I don't see any other hands raised. Are there any other thoughts that people want to share at this time? And again, we need, to the extent that you do have thoughts, please synthesize them in writing. That would be super helpful. I don't see any additionals at this, Mr. Contempasis. Okay, I don't see any additional hands raised at this time, so I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Parvex for public comment.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Okay, we have 15 speakers this evening, and each speaker will have 2 minutes per person. I will remind you when you have 20 seconds left. Please state your name, affiliation, what neighborhood you are from before you begin. When I call your name, please raise your hand virtually in Zoom. Also, please make sure you're signed into Zoom with the same name you used to sign up for public comment. That will allow us to identify you when it's your turn to testify. I will move you up as a panelist, and we will ask you to turn on your camera for public comment. Our first—
one moment, Ms. Parvex, before you begin, I just want to reiterate what you said with respect to the amount of time that each speaker has. And you're going to give, did you say a 20-second noted warning?
Yes.
So Ms. Parvex is going to provide the 20-second warning. When she indicates that time is up, and we're just full disclosure, this is for everybody. We will move to muting when time is up. So please, please, please adhere to Ms. Parvex's kind of 20-second warning. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. The first speaker is Micah Liu, followed by Suru Yang and Yufeng Rong. Please raise your hands. Micah Liu, please state what neighborhood you are from and open your camera. I don't see you there.
Thank you, Ms. Parvex.
Thank you. You can start.
Hi, everybody. My name is Mika Liu. I am 10 and a 4th grader in Quincy Elementary School in Chinatown. I have a K2 brother in the same school as me and a 7th grader brother in Boston Latin School. When I was 7, my mom and I went to a 7-Eleven close to my school. There was a white elderly lady there, and she yelled at me, "Go home to where you came from." I was too young to comprehend, but I was frightened. Now that I am older, I understand what she meant. I don't belong here. When I think of the impact of your zip code policy to Chinatown, I think of my 7-Eleven experience. I am an American, I live 10 minutes away from my school, yet this elderly lady didn't want me here. I have friends who, despite having B+ to A average, are told by you that they do not belong in the exam schools because they live in Chinatown 02111. A 6th grader string ensemble mate of mine have an A- GPA. I play the violin with her, and she lives in an affordable housing in Chinatown. Her parents don't speak English, her mom is a hotel cleaner, and her dad is a restaurant worker. She worked very hard to prepare her audition videos that got her into a prestigious music summer camp in Vermont on scholarship, where BPS denied her an exam school seat. Another place accepted her, recognizing her talent, hard work, and her family's financial needs. My question is, can you do that for families like my friends by changing your zip code plan so you do not exclude qualified kids in Chinatown anymore? During Black History Month, I shared a video of myself saying if America loved Black people and Black culture, it would be less segregated and more diverse. More people of different races would be living in the same buildings, neighborhoods, and towns. I believe that for exam schools too, but we do not exclude Chinese residents from the building to make more room for Black and Latino students. We make more buildings. We expand more seats to include more qualified, disadvantaged students. Exam schools do not have wait lists. Why is that? So many kids turn down exam schools to go to private schools. There must be extra spots for my friends. Actually, why don't you make Quincy Upper School an exam school? Then you will have more space for the students who are excluded under your zip code plan. Finally, I want to speak to my Chinese uncles and aunties out there. We do not leave Chinatown. We do not leave Boston. We depend on each other to make our schools excellent. We need to stick together. We are the descendants of dragons. Quincy Elementary and Quincy Upper School are good schools. Even though we do not get millions of dollars as donations, if I end up in Quincy Upper School, I will get a good education. In fact, I will get into an even better college than my Boston Latin school brother. No offense, Miss Scarrett. I am done. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Sorry, next speaker is Suri Yang. Suri Yang. Suri Yang. Please unmute yourself.
Hello, my name is Suri Yang. I am a 6th grade student and live in West Roxbury. Hello, my name is Suri Yang. I am a 6th grade student and live in West Roxbury. I wanted to go to the Boston Latin School and work hard in school in order for a good future. Previously, admission to the BLS was determined by taking an exam, but due to the ongoing pandemic, it was canceled. Now the BLS is using admission by zip code and previous GPAs. The reason this is a problem is that the new system is racially biased against Caucasian and Asian American families, due to the majority of the students getting in for the past years being either Asian American or Caucasian. Though we work hard to get in too. We are not let in just because of our race. Determining based on race is simply unfair and unjust, as we cannot control our identity. Determining based on zip code is as unjust, as we cannot control that as well. That is our parents' choice. This situation is the equivalent to the problem of the dystopian society in the short story Harrison Bergeron by Kurt Vonnegut. In Harrison Bergeron, in order to make everyone equal, handicaps were given to those who are smarter, stronger, and more beautiful, and so on. Some of those handicaps included handicap radios that would send loud sounds to disrupt thought, heavy bags on one's neck, and masks made to one look ugly. Now, although the situation in the short story is more exaggerated than the current situation, they are still of the same essence. Similar to the handicaps, those who score higher have lower chances, and the policies are unfair for one side and fair for another. we should not have to sacrifice fairness
20 seconds.
for someone in order to make it fairer for another. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Next speaker is Yufang Rong. Yufang. I thought is Yufang Rong on? I thought I moved her in. I will go to the next speaker. Elise Morgan. Please unmute yourself and start your camera.
Yes, hello. Thanks for taking my comment. My name is Elise Morgan. I live in Jamaica Plain. I'm the parent of 2 BPS students, and I've worked as an educator in high school and higher ed. I was relieved that grade inflation came up in the discussion today because that's the subject of my comment tonight, as I hadn't heard it mentioned recently in the task force discussions. I'm concerned about the pressure that will fall on the teachers in the sending schools if the admissions criteria are based entirely or even mostly on grades. I think it's important to remember, as I'm sure you all do, but I just want to state that the admissions process used for school year 21-22 used grades that at the time the grades were filed were not anticipated to be used for the admissions to the exam schools. So those grades were free of the grade inflation pressure that would have otherwise existed. This will not be the case moving forward if the same admission process is used. Students, their parents, and teachers and administrators at the sending schools will all know which grades will count before and as those grades are determined and filed. Prior to this past cycle, of course, people knew which grades would count, but grades were only half of the admissions criteria. My concern is that an admissions process that uses only grades or even mostly only grades will make the teachers at the sending schools be viewed less as educators and more as gatekeepers. This will be a huge disservice to them. In addition, despite the high level of professionalism in all the BPS teachers I've ever met, I think an assignment policy based even mostly on grades will invariably lead to grade inflation, and over time will make the admissions policy not sustainable. Because at some point there'll be so much compression at the top, there won't be any meaningful distinctions that could be made. Workarounds that were mentioned today, namely class rank and teacher recommendations, are perhaps worth considering, but will also increase the gatekeeper role of the teachers. So I hope that the task force is keeping the impact on teachers and the reality of grade inflation in mind as you continue your hard work on creating an admission policy for the future. Thanks very much for your time.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Sherry Kelleher. Please raise your hand. Sherry Kelleher. Please unmute yourself there. Thank you. Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
My name is Sherry Kelleher. I live in Charlestown. I have a student at the Boston Latin, a student at the WP, a 7th grader and a 9th grader. And I first of all want to thank everybody for all of the thought and effort that they are clearly putting in. It is a very hard task. I also question, I appreciate Mr. Contemposis's remark about the 800 versus the 25,000. I would actually question why the 800 versus the entire system. We clearly have issues with the pipeline. We clearly have issues with scarcity. And yet there's a lot of effort being put into these 3 schools and their admissions. And that seems disproportionate. And a lot of people are bringing quite a lot of, it seems like, baggage to the table when they're having these discussions. To a point somebody else made, I think it would be worthwhile to also talk about standard deviations as opposed to medians when you're talking about things like socioeconomic impact, single family households, etc. Because many of our neighborhoods are very, very diverse and the median is not representative. Charlestown is one of those locations where we have 3 public housing complexes, although I think Ms. Hogan's diagram only showed 2. Clarity and transparency would be so welcome, because this has been somewhat disastrous over the last year. And one of the things that I really wonder is why, when I understand why the process was so different this year, I don't understand why there needs to be a rush to judgment for June 23rd, when these are matters of measuring capability and tenacity, which we don't really have measures for right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Michelle Danda, followed by Somi Kim and Maya Brodyfield. Michelle Danda. I don't see Michelle Danda. Somi Kim. Please unmute yourself and start your camera. You're muted.
Hello?
Yes.
Hi, thank you. Hi, my name is Somi Kim. I live in Mattapan. I identify as Asian American. My husband is Dominican American. Our children are multiracial. Our son is a sophomore at Boston Latin Academy, and our daughter is a 4th grader at Mildred Ave. I'd like to thank the task force for all the dedication and time that you've poured into this debate on equity and inequity in Boston. And I would like to express my strong support for reforming the exam school admissions process. Just from this year's zip code reform, I think it's amazing that next year's incoming class will be a better reflection of the city of Boston. I'm heartened by the opportunities and access given to students typically left out of these public resources. I'm glad that privileged students, particularly at Boston Latin School, will have the opportunity to be in community with students from diverse and rich backgrounds. I think we overlook that, right? The assets that students from diverse backgrounds bring to school communities. These young people are our future leaders, and if they are not in relationship with each other, we will continue to live in the divided and segregated society we currently live in now. I disagree that we need to maintain some form of status quo assessment to ensure that students are ready, quote unquote, qualified to handle the exam schools or college. I think we can create better systems of support and accommodations to ensure that every student has the support they need to succeed and be their whole selves. We have deep societal problems, and this inequity is reinforced by the exam schools. It only deepens these problems. I want to applaud Simon, the student here, for his astute question. Sorry, 20 seconds. What is the purpose of exam schools? What is the purpose of ushering students with the most privilege into one school? If the exam schools have the most resources, wouldn't it make sense to re-examine the purpose of them and instead send our least resource students there? I second his recommendation, accepting students based on combination of GPA, being a BPS student, and socioeconomic status. I encourage the task force to continue pushing for change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Maya Brodyfield. Deron Lee. Deron Lee.
Here. Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you. Please start your video.
Okay. 1 second. Can you see me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you everyone. And let me take a look. So,
Mr. Lee, we cannot see you.
You cannot see me?
No.
We could see you for a second. Thank you.
How about now?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, how about now? Sorry, I held write down the, can you see me now?
No.
Okay, I have written my kind of comments on the paper, on the iPhone. Sorry, can I just read my comments? Otherwise, I don't think I can remember it.
Yes, please.
Okay, so look at, thanks a lot for the opportunity. And really, my comment is, look at what this committee did. You basically failed most of the feeder school students. Now you play politics, shift the parents and the students' focus from working hard on improving the feeder schools to debating who should have the privilege to get into exam school. And last year, you used the name of equity, eliminated many hardworking kids' opportunity to study in exam schools. This committee could not fix feeder school, and now have the dramatic change on entrance of exam schools. It's clear to me this committee will not only destroy exam school, but also feeder schools. Think about it. Currently, you are teaching kids. As long as you are smart, as long as your parents have low income, or live in the right zip code, no need to work hard anymore. You have the privilege over other kids to enter exam school. Will kids study hard anymore? What's equity? Many first-generation immigrants like me need to spend 4 or 5 hours to prepare these 2 minutes comments, while you could give out 2 minutes beautiful comments in seconds. Our kids don't have the English learning environment like your kids. Will you consider equity when you evaluate immigrant case for school or a job? I really hope. Let's talk about equity. That this committee has a breakdown of equity. Do we have the data on why the kids did not get into exam school using merit-based method? What percentage is because of low income, or because of race, or because of lack of hard work, lack of commitment? Do we have a number on how much income is needed to ensure a student have an adequate education opportunity? Equity is putting all kids on equal footing, prepare each kid be ready for exam school, not just put the students into exam schools arbitrarily based on race, zip code, and income. Let's turn our focus on understand what resources are needed to put all students on an equal footing. Yeah, thank you. Down here.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Karen Lee. Karen. Karen, can you please unmute yourself and start your video?
Oh, excuse my background. Sorry, I was in a normal meeting and then it just sort of put me in here. But anyway, my name is Karen. I am a graduate of Boston Latin School. I graduated in 2004. And I wanted to talk today in particular to the comments raised regarding the concern about without an exam, students admitted to exam schools based on their performance and not the results of an inherently biased standardized test would somehow jeopardize the academic integrity and rigor provided at these schools, and that it sets diverse students up for failure by placing them in a school that's beyond what they're academically prepared for. Most of these comments are started with qualifying statements indicating that that positionality has nothing to do with race or racism, but I wanted to set the record straight and say that it absolutely does have everything to do with race and racism. And if you do not understand why, I would strongly encourage you to go and do some research about how systemic bias and oppression manifests itself. But I also wanted to put in a plug for students like me coming from normal Boston public schools. Although I do carry white privilege, I came to Boston Latin School with only a very general Boston public school education. And it is true that the education I got from my Boston public schools was not at all rigorous, did not prepare me for the demands of an exam school, And as someone whose parents had her when they were teenagers, I definitely was not privileged enough to have external supplementation to that education that gave me any sort of leg up on being admitted to or succeeding in an exam school. But despite those odds, I not only survived 6 years at BLS, but I thrived, and it opened doors for me that otherwise would have remained shut, including being the very first person in my entire extended family to earn a college degree. I would like to implore those parents who are trying to get legal ramifications in support of maintaining an inequitable exam system to reconsider redirecting their relative wealth towards paying for their children's education and leaving the relatively few free resources that were intended for people like us who need it the most, and not further privilege those who can pay out of pocket for a great education at our expense.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Yuhong Jia. I don't see that name. Oh, there. Yuhong Jia. Please unmute yourself and start your camera. We can't hear you. Hello? We can't hear you. Maybe you could try to leave and come back. Otherwise, you can send us your written testimony. Okay. So I will try with the next speaker because I think it's not working. So I will try with the next speaker. The next speaker is Stephen Yang. Stephen Yang. Please unmute yourself and start your camera.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Raj, for the opportunity. So I'm Steve Young from West Roxbury. So exam school admission policy is very critical to the Boston. I appreciate the contribution from task force, but current task force is not professional and the representative enough to make this critical decision. There is strong voice in the task force to keep zip code policy and cancel the exam. If this becomes true, this policy will impact Boston dramatically and negatively. First of all, many kids' future will be impacted negatively. They cannot earn a spot by their hard working, but their future will be determined by the zip code they live. Second, as there will be many uncertainty if the kids can be admitted to the exam school, many people will move out from Boston and nobody will move into Boston. The housing market will drop dramatically and thus tax will decrease and resources will decrease. And eventually Boston public school will become worse. Third, Boston exam school will become average Boston public school. Boston National School is currently ranked as A+, while BPS in general is ranked as C+. The current exam school admission policy protects them from particular intemperance. Without the exam and with the zip code policy, Boston exam school will eventually collapse into average. The current task force is not representative enough. For example, Ms. Sullivan strongly advocates zip code policy, but barely speaks of the importance of exam. she is currently the president of the National Association for the Advancement of Color.
You have 20 seconds left.
The mission of the NAPC is to ensure the education of equality for the colored people. She speaks loud for the specific population, but who speaks for the others? The current task force is not professional enough. For example, academic rigor is taught very often, but few of them could be memorable and enjoyable. The exam is not a perfect way to evaluate a student, but please find the equivalent.
Your 2 minutes are up.
Or better way, not a worse one. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And can we remind speakers, Ms. Parvex, that their videos should be on? If videos are not on, we're not going to be able to allow for speakers. Okay, videos must be on.
Thank you, Ms. Sullivan. Next speaker is Lauren Peter. Lauren Peter. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for giving me the chance to talk tonight. I am the parent of a first grader in Boston Public Schools, and I am a product of the Texas experiment. I was 2 years behind the first when they started it. I can say, having lived through it, it caused a lot of upheaval, and it caused a lot of people. It caused a lot of upheaval in people's decision making. My apologies. You're cute. The thing that
I think we lost you.
This the same thing the most this. Can you hear me?
Very not that well. Would you be able to send us your written testimony? I think you're frozen.
Hi, sorry. I'm going to sum up in about 30. The thing that I would say about this task force is that they have thought of this very deep, and I appreciate that. I know that a lot of people have been very disappointed this year, and I feel that deeply because I felt it when I didn't get into the college that I wanted to get into. I hope that we don't take our personal disappointments and apply that to something that is an experiment that could really make people's lives a lot better and could really fix inequities. So let's push forward, and let's continue to look at this deeply. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Dora Golding. I don't see anyone with that name. Abby Maxson Carter. Please turn on your camera and unmute yourself.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you. We can hear you.
Okay, great. Hi, my name is Abby Maxson Carter. I'm from Roslindale. I'm a mom of a 3-year-old who's a rising K1 student in BPS. I have about a decade under my belt as an educator at UMass Boston. And I want to say first that I want to really applaud this task force. You have a great group of people here, and you've clearly thought really deeply about these problems. And I want you to be strong in your work towards making a more equitable education for everyone in Boston. You're not going to be able to make everyone happy, but I think we need that equity in our schools. And I would say for my part, since my kid is so young, I want to just speak first about a vision. I hope that in 10 years, when my kid goes to high school, that there will no longer be the sense of winners and losers in Boston. I hope that when we're ready to pick a high school, we'll have a choice of well-funded, well-resourced high schools that serve a wide variety of kids from different backgrounds, really well, that he'll be able to go to an integrated, less segregated school, and will feel excited, and that it's preparing him for a great life. I would say that some of you guys might be familiar with the metaphor of an airplane with education, the idea of headwinds and tailwinds, headwinds making it harder for the plane to move forward, tailwinds pushing it forward. And I would just say that I think if we don't talk about headwinds and tailwinds in this context, that we're really not hitting the nail on the head. It's not a useful conversation. So I think that, tailwinds be things, both of those headwinds and tailwinds being things like the amount of income a family has, if they're worried about eviction, the amount of education that a parent has, disabilities, stuff like that. You guys know all this stuff, but I would say that I don't honestly think that it's that great to have a system that isolates kids with strong headwinds or strong tailwinds into different schools. I think that they should go to schools together and they should be excellent. I'm intrigued by the lottery idea. I think if you're going to have an exam, you need a system to let all sixth graders know about what their options are. You need free test prep. Okay. And I think the Chicago plan's not terrible. That's all.
Thank you very much. Next speaker is Yufeng Rong. Yufeng?
Yes. Hi. Can you see me? I cannot see myself.
Please turn on your camera.
Oh yeah. Let me see. Okay. Now you can see me.
Thank you.
Hi. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving me the chance to speak again. My name is Yufeng Rong. I'm from West Roxbury. I'm a parent of Boston Public School. Mr. Azevedo mentioned many times that the new process should be gaming proof or at least gaming resistant. So any method using geographic factors such as zip code, census tract, or geocode is not gaming resistant. For example, wealthy people can always temporarily move to a favored zip code and then moving back. So today, Dr. Shepherd emphasized how GPA is better than SAT or ACT. However, I agree with Ms. Garrett and Ms. Azevedo. College application is totally different from middle school application. College application uses a big package, and the data they used in their regression research are the already admitted students based on the whole package. And this 1 year GPA only admission demonstrated how unreliable if you only use GPA. Again, the Harvard Kennedy School report Institute report pointed out that using only the MCAS exam can increase Boston Latin School Black and Latino students by up to 50%. We should further explore this thought and examine what if we use MAP test. Each student can take multiple MAP tests, for example, at the beginning and end of 5th grade and the beginning and middle of 6th grade. Sure, and then there are multiple points, including absolute score and growth score. And Mr. Contempas proposed a long list today. All the items on the list are great, but the only problem is timing. It's already late May. Even if you can come up with a new proposal, we still need a lot of time to evaluate. That's all. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we were going to try again with Yuhong Jia. Yuhong Jia, please unmute yourself and start your camera.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
We can hear you now, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Hello, my name is Yuhong Jia and I live in West Roxbury. I'm a parent of 2 BPS students as well as a teacher working in a private school. I'm here today to support taking the test to enter the exam schools. First of all, admission to exam schools by zip code is not only racially biased, but also a discriminatory measure. The policy doesn't provide equal opportunity to the people who are economically disadvantaged. One of my former students lived in Dorchester, but he could still afford to attend an expensive private school. You cannot judge people based on where they live. Secondly, GPA can be a measure for admission, but not the only measure, since each school and each teacher has a different set of standards and a different grading system. One of my coworkers teaches Spanish. She's a great teacher, but also very strict. It is more difficult to get an A in her class, but most of her students can get a gold or silver key in the national Spanish exam. So if we only base admission on GPA, there may be manipulation and abuse of the system, and the student who deserve to get in won't be admitted. If that happens, the academic standard in Boston will be harmed. I know making a policy is not easy, but I would recommend the following measures. First, continue to administer exams along with GPA. I would recommend to use either the MCAS or the MAP test. As we all know, each BPS student needs to take the MCAS test every year, and many BPS school teachers use the MAP test to evaluate their teaching and the students' learning. If students in independent schools or homeschooled cannot take it, the task force can choose a day for those students to take either the test if they want to apply to exam schools. Second, though, rather than using the zip code, I would recommend using the parent tax forms as one of the measures. This way, low-income families are more likely to get priority. In the end, I would like to challenge the task force members. Your decision will have a profound impact on Boston Public Schools as well as Boston at large. The result may have a positive outcome or some consequences. I would like the task force members to consider all the options and make the best decision that would benefit Boston, not only in the short term, but also in the long run. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Sullivan, Mr. Contampasis, that concludes our speaker for tonight.
Thank you. Are there any other comments that folks have for tonight? Okay, Ms. Aguirre.
Yes, I just realized, because I missed the part of the meeting last time, and I went to watch it on the BPS website, and I realized that actually in the BPS website, most of the materials are only in English. The agenda is translated in many languages, but the minutes are not. The presentations are only sometimes translated in other languages, and the video, as far as I realized, is only in English. There are more people watching the video than actually can attend the meetings. So I think that will be very important for having like more people having access to the discussion and make it more equitable and more transparent, that all the materials are translated. And also I wonder if the emails that we are receiving with the people who are presenting their comments in writing, if they are going to be in the website and if they can also be translated. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Aguirre. We'll follow whatever, as a task force of the school committee, we'll follow whatever the school committee is doing. And so we'll be sure to confirm with the chair and vice chair how they would like to, how they are currently handling those issues that you've raised, and we will follow suit as a task force of the school committee. Mr. Contampasis, I don't see any other hands raised, I don't believe. So I think we're ready. You're on mute.
Thank you. And thank you all for your patience. It's been a long evening. If there's nothing further, I will entertain a motion to adjourn the meeting. May I have a motion, please?
So moved.
May I have a second?
I second.
Thank you. Is there any discussion or objection to the motion? Hearing none, Ms. Parvek, will you please call a roll?
Thank you. Mr. Acevedo?
Aye.
Ms. Aguirre?
Aye.
Mr. Chernow?
Aye.
Mr. Kreger?
Aye.
Dr. Freeman Wisdom? Ms. Lam?
Aye.
Ms. Nagasawa?
Aye.
Ms. Garrett?
Aye.
Dr. Tang?
Aye.
Ms. Waite? Ms. Sullivan,
Aye.
and Mr. Contempasses.
Aye. Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, folks. See you all Tuesday.